Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the September edition of the Sustainable Futures Seminar Series. We've got a bit of a double header for the One Bin project today. So we've got Kristoffer Kortsen from and Torik Holmes, who both work on the One Bin project, and they're telling us all about One Bin to rule them all. It's also an incredibly interdisciplinary afternoon because Chris is a polymer chemist working in materials engineering, and Torik is a social scientist working in the Sustainable Consumption Institute. So Chris and Torik are going to tell us all about the project, what they found, the exciting developments it could lead to, implications for our economy and society, and it's a really interesting product, and we're all looking forward to hearing about it. We do have a Q&A afterwards. The talk's probably going to be about 40 minutes, and then we've got Q&A, so put your questions into the chat, and I'll put them to Torik and Chris afterwards. I think Torik, it's over to you. Thank you.
That's good. Thanks, Steve. Thanks also to Emily for hosting this as well. Chris, it's telling me I've got control, so I'm gonna go. We're going with dual control. So yeah, so welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. My name's Torik Holmes. I'm a social scientist, like Steve said, working on the One Bin to Rule Them All project. I'm joined by my colleague Chris today. We're also representing it's a 6-person team in total. And I think, one of the things to say from the outset is that One Bin to Rule Them All is an interdisciplinary project through and through. So we've got material scientists involved in the project. We've got Maria and Adeyemi, who've got expertise with circular economy and business models. And then you've got myself and Helen, who are social scientists. So what is One Bin to Rule Them All? Oh, sorry, Chris, it's not clicking through.
No, it is.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Okay, so One Bin to Rule Them All, what is it? Well, first and foremost, it's a hypothesis and it's an idea. The really simple idea that underpins it is that if we were to collect all plastics in one bin, household plastics, what plastic would we get? What would be the value of that plastic? What would be the value of the resources that were in there? What should we do with all of those plastics? Are there some that we should arguably be getting rid of that shouldn't be even in circulation? And there's some that can be lumped together and recycled together? Are there others that demand other processing sort of qualities? And crucially, if we are to collect all plastics in one bin, what does that mean for what we're expecting households to do? How do households do the recycling? What are the challenges to do with that? And again, building onto that, if we do collect all of them, what's the cost implications? What's the economic realities of that? And how crucially do we, if we were to implement such a system, how do we maximize the value of the goods and the resources that are in the bin? And when we're talking about value, we're not just talking there about economic value, we're also talking about the sustainability and environmental value of thinking in a more circular way, and the social and environmental benefits of doing so. So yeah, as I've said, Steve has said, it's an interdisciplinary project. So just taking the hypothesis of One Bin to Rule Them All, the idea of collecting all household plastics in one bin. From a materials perspective, immediately we need to start thinking about what are the materials that are going to be collected? What are the types of plastic that are in there, and how should we sort them? Do we need to think, instead of sorting by resin code, do we need to start thinking about actually sorting by material type? And what does that imply? What are the implications of doing so, and how can that be done? What materials are out there? Again, thinking of the economic realities, what happens when you get all this stuff? What business models do you need to spur on companies to think, actually, yeah, we are going to implement a way of, say, collecting flexible plastics and having them processed and recycled? And from a sociological perspective, we have to think about how it is that we engage with packaging, what packaging is, how we identify it, how we clean it, what we're expecting households to do, and what are the best rules. Immediately, we start thinking about how complex it is to sort and do the recycling, how we can actually make things easier for people to get it right, so that we can maximize the resources that are in circulation and the value of those. Now, the reason that that idea and the high sort of hypothesis that underpins One Bin to Rule Them All is needed is because in a sort of real world sense, we're caught up in a bit of a plastics balancing act as it stands. In 2019, it's estimated about 9% of plastics were recycled globally. Even if you look and you zoom into countries and places where we're recycling more, so say we take the UK, recycling in the UK of plastics has been between 40 and about 45% for close to a decade. It's stagnated at that rate, and it's proved really stubborn to change and to improvement. We also have a real persistent problem with contamination of recyclables, whereby either households put the wrong items in the recycling, or where curbside collections, the people that are collecting the recyclables post the items into the wrong segments of bins, so that when they get to the MRFs, where they're material recovery facilities, where they're sorted, they're contaminated. In a lot of instances, whole loads can get rejected. And not only are we not doing particularly well in terms of how much we're recycling already, but the problem's set to get bigger increasingly, because we're going to be producing more and more plastic up till 2050. The projections are showing that by 2050, production of plastic is set to reach 1 billion tons. So the problem is stark as it is and as it stands now, and it's only set to get worse. So we really need to start thinking, okay, how do we do things differently, and how do we innovate? The reason it's a balancing act is because plastics are a wonderful family of materials. If we didn't have plastics, the weight and carbon footprint of a lot of goods and resources that are in circulation would be much higher. It'd be much less efficient. Arguably, we'd have more food waste if we didn't have plastics. And if we think just as one example in terms of responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, how much plastic was integral to the way in which that was dealt with in terms of PPE, getting tests out, and all that type of stuff. Plastics are really, really important. So we've got a balancing act to strike. What we really need to do is think, how do we efficiently reap the benefits of plastics, which are manifold, and limit the negative pernicious consequences to do with environmental pollution and that type of stuff. Now, in terms of that balancing act, as it stands, we're really not doing a particularly good job, arguably. What we have is a panoply of rules and different expectations from spread out across the UK. The story is different if you zoom in Wales. Wales does recycle more than, say, England and Scotland, but more broadly speaking, we have around about 39 different bin collection regimes sort of at play. When we talk about that, what we're talking about there are the number of different sort of political contexts, socio-political contexts that are at play. So different types of bins in terms of the shape, colour, size of receptacles that are used for households, different collection schedules, different expectations of what goes into the bin. In certain areas, they may collect plastics, pots, tubs and trays. They may not. They may want, bottles as well, but in some areas they may want bottles, but they want the lids removed. In other areas, they'll say, we want all of your dry recyclables put together. Some will want them separated so that your paper and card are in different bins. So there's a lot of different rules at play. And these are all, because waste is, for historical reasons, has been devolved. There are 391 or so local authorities, and I think it's 200 and odd waste collection authorities. So there's a huge amount of variety, basically, of what's going on. And I looked it up before. If we think about households as well, just for a second, there's 28.2 million households in the UK. Each of those is basically an appendage to a MRF, because over the last 20 years, we've asked people to take on more responsibility in terms of sorting their recyclable waste. So when we take that into consideration, if we look beyond the MRFs that are already out there, and we consider households to be part of that, then the scale of the challenges at play and the need for, when we start thinking about tidying up the mess that we face, is really quite big and is quite stark. So based on those two contexts, a real world context of sort of the messiness that we face, and this idea in response of collecting all plastics in one bin, the idea really speaks to the point that we need standardization across material uses, collection and processing. It also speaks to the idea that we need complementing infrastructure. So if we do collect all plastics in one bin, what type of infrastructure would we need to deal with that? We're aware that we need households to buy into this. We need everyday practices that produce high value recycler. So, and that's not just when we're thinking about the role of this idea and the role of collecting all plastics in one bin. We're also aware that there's other practitioners at play, those involved in packaging design, those involved in the production of chemicals and polymers, those involved in the production of stabilizers and colorants, and all of these things that go into our packaging and the effects that they have on the ability of us to recycle plastics. And yeah, we need collaborative business models in order to make it economically viable. And of course, we need relationships across the board that enable systemic change. And that's really what we need, is based on the sort of story, the messy history I've described and the state of play that we've got at the moment, we really do need systemic change. So based on all that sort of history of the idea of one bin to rule them all, this is all still very hypothetical up to this point. So for us, it was really important to think about what actually happens if you put this into practice. What do you get, and what happens when you test the idea? So that's what we've done, and what we're going to be talking about from now on. Really, the findings from a series of trials that we ran and some work that came out of that. So what we did as a team is we ran a 3-part study with 30 households in an area of Greater Manchester. The households were split across the indices of deprivation. So we had 10 households in the lower end, sort of the more impoverished end of the deprivation, 10 in the middle, and then 10 the most sort of deprived end. And that was based on multiple indices of deprivation. And I can talk a bit more about that if there's any questions on that. And the reason that we did that is research shows that depending on your sort of socio-economic context, the patterns of consumption and the way in which you may be involved in recycling can differ. So we were interested in exploring those differences. It might sound, sometimes it sounds to people like 30 households doesn't sound like a lot, but the design of the study purposefully took into account the importance of getting in-depth insights from households. So there have been research before that goes and looks at recycling and through survey collection and stuff like that. Surveys will give you an idea of what's going on. They won't necessarily give you a great deal of detail to explain what's going on and why things are the way they are. So based on that, the design of the study involved a pre-trial interview where I went and spoke typically for an hour to each household. Then we would give them the bin for the 2-week trial period. We would collect all of the plastics, and the very simple direction was to just put anything you identified as plastic into the bin. So we collected those. But there's a team of us from the SMI hub, about 10 or 12 of us went and we sorted all of that plastic waste. We did a sort by material type and by item type. So by material type, we mean by the actual type of polymer. And then by the item type, we mean, was it a drinks bottle? Was it a shampoo bottle? Was it a pot tub? Was it a food grade pot, tub and tray, or a non-food pot, tub and tray? We did 2 kinds of analysis, and we used an FTIR as well, so we could identify certain plastics that were didn't necessarily have a label on them to say, oh, it was HDPE or LDP and stuff like that. Crucially, after we conducted the trial, I went back again and interviewed them to get an understanding of how they found the trial and key challenges to do with doing the recycling. So in terms of what that resulted in, over 400,000 words worth of transcript, which have been thematically analysed over the last year or so by myself and Helen. We had obviously the 30 bins worth of rubbish. That was totaled close to 6,000 items that we sorted over the course of a couple of weekends. And we did also run a survey to get an understanding of the sort of snapshot understanding of what participated in the project involved and the results of that. So in terms of the results, we're going to split these into 2 sort of points of discussion. First is what we found from the interviews, really. So the sort of key insights that we found from participation in the project. There was a great deal of enthusiasm the people that we spoke to felt like they were part of something bigger. And I think that speaks to the fact that sustainability and sort of environmental politics are really front and center for a lot of people now, and they are really important. And I should say it wasn't particularly difficult for us to recruit people. There was a real thirst to be engaged in the project. There was clear frustration straight away when we spoke to people about people quite impassioned about their bins and the recycling. There was limitations to curbside collections, and so in some instances people said, look, if the bins were overflowing, they might get creative and hide stuff, and that was interesting, because I think typically what would happen is people would get the blame for that as if they were doing something wrong, which is one way of seeing it. Another way of seeing it is actually the sheer sort of size of and the capacity of the bins has an impact on what people do. With more people working from home, more packaging being delivered to the home, people were expressing a real difficulty with managing the amount of space they had in their bins. Other people explained to us that based on the context they found themselves in, which in this instance meant that pots, tubs and trays weren't collected as part of their normal recycling, they would collect all their pots, tubs and trays and then transport them once every month or 2 months up to their mum's house in Cumbria, because that's an area where they were collected for recycling. So people don't just accept the rules at play. Sometimes they will go to great lengths to try and avoid those. And there are carbon footprint implications of people taking matters into their own hands in that sort of bespoke fashion. Yeah, a lot of people spoke about doing what they can to avoid plastic packaging. So avoiding small plastic bags when they say went and got their fruit and veg, avoiding multi-packs and stuff like that. But there are limits to doing that. And it was clear that those on the lower ends of economics of deprivation didn't necessarily have the funds to sort of buy themselves out, or in that sense, I didn't feel as if they had the money to make those types of those choices, and were frustrated by that. There was also a huge amount of frustration just to do with the sheer amount of messaging and the confusion around the amount of logos that people find on packaging and what exactly those mean. And I think one of the things we've discussed as a group is this sort of crisis of classification. Over the past probably 30 to 40 years, we have this layering of logos and systems aimed at trying to get people to do the recycling, and they don't always map up and align with each other. So sometimes you'll have like widely recycled on a piece of packaging when actually in the area it's not collected for recycling at all. So there was a real sort of frustration with the messaging and how confounding that could be. Yeah, one of the other things we found was 55% of the items by weight in the one bin trial area were not collected for recycling. Yeah, another thing that came up was that basically we live in a far too complicated material world. If we think about the materials that are in and the packaging that's in circulation, two things come up really. One is that you've got a lot of multi-materials. You've got a lot of packaging made up of 2 or 3 or 4 different types of material that are clearly identifiable as different. So that might be paper, that might be plastic, it might be foil. You've also got a lot of packaging that is quite imitative. So it looks like and it behaves like a certain material, say like a foil, but actually might be a plastic. Waxy bread bags, for example. Some say I've got these waxy bread bags. Well, that would just be paper with a laminate, a plastic laminate on them, and that makes it really difficult for people to distinguish what's what and where to put things when it comes. So when we think back to all of these, the 28.2 million homes, and thinking about those as appendages to MRFs, we think, well, actually, the packaging doesn't really fit into and make it easy for people to decide what goes where. And then on a positive note, there was really no negative feedback from participating in the project. Everyone felt that just being asked to put just plastics in one bin was easier than what they had going on at that moment. And that's not to say that it was, isn't a sort of the answer, because of these issues to do with multi-materials, for example, and to do with imitated packaging, but it did make things a bit easier for them. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to pass over to Chris in a second, but just say, so this is pictures of us just sorting the waste when we picked them up from the trial. And I suppose there's just a couple of nice examples here of when you do ask for all plastics, you have to be careful what you ask for, because there's a lot of plastic out there. And one of the things we've realized is that actually we're probably best off saying, if we were to just ask for just plastic packaging, that might get rid of some of the other nastier stuff that we got. such as someone had done an oil change on their car and they'd put the oil drum in there as well, and some other engine oil. But that raises a really good point of actually what should we be doing with this stuff as well. So we do need to think beyond just packaging and recycling more broadly in industrial settings and stuff like that. And then you can also see from a picture there of people thinking carefully about actually cutting out Tetra Pak, tops of Tetra Paks that have clearly got pieces of plastic on them to try and get them into the bin, but the other stuff would have went into their paper. So I'm gonna leave it there. Chris, I'll hand over to you to get into the details of actually what we found in the bins.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, so it was a real group effort to collect and sort this waste. Sadly, I was not part of it, but it was a big group effort. But from the material side, what we then wanted to do was look at what's the material we've got, how do we sort it now, what potential sorting can we do, try to make sense of this entire mess of almost 6,000 items, right? So the first thing we did was make a count of all the different materials based on a little bit on resin type, but also on form factors, so bottles and pots, tubs, and trays, splitting up in food and non-food. Mainly doing that because non-food plastic items are less valuable than food plastic items. So if you have a non-food plastic bottles, you can't recycle them into a food grade plastic item. So those would need to be separated if we wanted to maximize that value. And then the first thing I thought when I saw this graph was we have a lot of large material classes, so food grade pots, tubs, and trays in polypropylene, for example. But then we also have these small amounts of non-food that are actually contaminating that waste stream. So could we be a bit provocative and make some extreme changes and say we try to optimize this, for example? What if we say food bottles can only be made out of PET and HDPE, because those are the main classes in our count we found, and then non-food bottles would then have to be made out of polypropylene or other plastic items. We can do the same again for pots, tubs, and trays, and you can actually, that way, without changing our sorting infrastructure, actually get food-grade recyclable material. That's a bit of a more extreme intervention, but it got us thinking about all the different ways that we can try and optimize this whole mess, right? And Torik also mentioned all these confusing labels and codes. That got us thinking of what the point is of these resin codes, right? So if we take our rigid plastics and also our flexibles, where we split them up in metallized or non-metallized, so that'll be metallized will be a crisp packet, for example, that has a metal layer and then 2 plastic layers around it. And then we tried to overlay that with the resin codes, get a lot of back and forth of why it's wrong. Mainly, for example, here for PET, the resin code doesn't capture any detail, right? So you'll still get your food grade PET bottle mixed with a metallized laminate, and those are not, you can't recycle those together. So there needs to be more separation than the resin code could provide. And then on the other hand, the other category, do you really need to separate those out if none of them are recyclable anyway? They're a bit too much detail to give to people. And then the cartons that Torik mentioned, even if you start cutting them out, there's still plastic in every single bit there. There's still paper in every single bit and metal. So what kind of resin code are you even putting on that? They're just completely irrelevant at that point. So we kind of stripped it back to basics and thought we need to make a clear system of how we can sort all these different items to retain maximum value. And that's where we started to develop this plastic hierarchy of fates, where we're looking at processing and sorting purely based on the material outcome. So how can we optimize the material outcome and not just looking at the polymer backbone or the resin code? So if we have all this mixed waste from our 1-bin trial, it comes into a sorting facility. There are a bunch of choices that can be made. So there are some of them that are quite simple. We obviously want to separate our bottles away from our cartons or polystyrene foam trays. But then within the bottle stream, there are further choices that could be made. So we'd want to separate there on resin code, so our PETs away from PE and PP. But you can go much further than that as well. So we talked about food grade already a bit, but there's also color or viscosity. You know, some trays will feel a bit softer or harder. There's chemistry behind that. You might want to go really, really far. Say, should we be mixing Coca-Cola and Pepsi bottles? We could separate those if we invest enough money. Obviously, that's not giving us more value, so that would be going too far. But it's about finding that nuance of what investment is worthwhile to get more added value. So basically trying to retain plastics in their highest material value. And as Torik mentioned, that's not only economic value, that's also sustainability and environmental value, right? So trying to circularize as much plastic as possible. So the hierarchy is all about visualizing these different waste streams and actually seeing how a lot of them are interconnected. So you'll have a lot of contaminations that are ubiquitous across the whole system, where you'll have nuance and detail in the different sorting streams and that actually affect each other if you do more sorting or less. And then also depending on what your recycling outcome is, if you're going for mechanical or chemical recycling and the different advantages and disadvantages of those different fates. So this is a massive online tool. You can find it on tinyurl.com/plastics hierarchy. It'll be in the presentation afterwards as well. I'd implore everyone to go and play with it. It's huge, but should be quite accessible. So it has all the different information in little small bite-sized chunks, and you can really get a feel for what recycling actually is and how the sorting could be done to improve sustainability. I'll just go through an example of what the hierarchy can actually bring for a practical item here. So say we get this HDPE bottle into a sorting facility. It's not just a HDPE bottle. It has a blue polypropylene cap because we like mixing plastics, and a sticky label that can be all kinds of material and the glue as well. So in the hierarchy, you'll get a lot of information about these different components, and it'll be about what the best achievable outcomes are. So which recycling outcome is the most sustainable and can give you the most value. Also, what kind of sorting and processing levels are needed to get to that outcome. So for different outcomes, you'll need more pure waste streams. But it'll also address what the plastic supply chain can do. So this product is maybe not perfect for recycling. What can the producers do to make it better? And also, how does it link to other plastic streams? So what other plastic streams are being contaminated by this? So if we think from our one bin, which we did a one bin for all plastics, but it could be for everything in commingled waste. The first thing that would happen when it comes in is that you'd sort it away from the paper, the metal, the other recyclables, and then you'd separate the flexible plastics from the rigid plastics. And then there's going to be contaminating materials. So there's a bit more detail in the hierarchy about those as well, but a few of the ones that we found in the household trial that made me chuckle a bit were textiles. So someone quite rightly realized their shirt was made out of plastic. So they put their old fleece sweater in there, and that's technically correct, but quite an interesting contaminant that you might get in a sorting process. Also, biodegradables are a really contentious subject, and there's a lot of detail and nuance about the different issues and opportunities about those in the hierarchy. But if we continue a bit further with the rigid plastics, which is where this shampoo bottle would end up, we'd then split it into the different resin codes. So we'd have our polypropylene and PET waste streams. This one would go into HDPE, and then we'd have sorted out other non-recyclables. So from the HDPE level, we still have a lot of different materials there. So we still have our bottles, we'll have pot stubs and trays and other form factors. So here there's other sorting choices to be made. The first one would be bottles, as this one is more valuable than a pot tub and tray. So is it worth doing that sorting? So we know for PET bottles that's commonly done, but actually if we look at the waste count we had, and we look at HDPE, we see it's mainly bottles and there's barely any pot stubs and trays. So that small amount of pot stubs and trays can probably just be incorporated into that recycling stream. So that separation might actually not be worth it in this case. So that'll depend on your local waste mixes that you'd get in your area. Another option is food and non-food. So food, including cosmetics like this one, have more value than non-food. But there the question is, how would you sort that? So we have a significant amount of both. In the hierarchy, there'll be a bit of explanation about the potential technologies that can help there. We had our extreme case of let's ban half of them and then the other half is great. But there's also the option of AI sorting or tagging and things like that. And that'll all be alluded to in the hierarchy with details and links on how to find out more. And finally, there's color. So if you have a colorless waste stream, you can make any material out of that. If once you put color in, you can't take it out. So colorless is the most valuable. So you could sort by color. But to sort by color, you have to have enough material, and sometimes producers make stupid choices. So there was a while ago that Head and Shoulders made this bottle. There's obviously not enough Azure Mediterranean blue HDPE bottles in the world to make it worthwhile sorting that. So that value of that waste stream has been brought down by that product, but you can't regain that value by doing this additional sorting. But that's not the case for all colors. So if we think of PET bottles, you'll have a lot of green or light blue bottles there. And in France and Italy, the main water companies are green. So you have the Perrier and the San Pellegrinos. And that's actually quite a stable waste stream. So it's worthwhile making that separation between clear and transparent green in those locations. So that's, again, depending on your area and depending on the specifics of your waste stream, it can be a valuable choice. But then on a more international scale, Sprite has changed the color of their bottles to go to clear to actually make it more recyclable that way and have less contamination in the waste stream. So a lot of people actually hadn't noticed this change. So that's just good marketing for you right there. So that's how actually producers can also influence this. So that's already alluding to it a bit, that we're actually focusing on the waste management and the recycling a lot. But that's not the only part of the supply chain that matters. It's actually the whole supply chain from your synthesis to processing of your products and brand owners, all the way before you actually get to the sorting, that actually has a lot of influence on the quality of your recycling. So if we go through them one by one, we actually should probably start at polymer synthesis, because if we do something there, we can actually ruin recycling before we've ever gotten to a product. So polymer synthesis takes oil and makes these plastic pellets. I've picked some horribly clear colors there that are obviously bad for recycling, but they can make all kinds of stuff. Here, the things that could go wrong is that they're putting in additives and colors, and there's residues from the polymerization reaction that all have an effect on recycling. And nowadays, none of this is being tested or looked into. They also have no reason to report any of the things that they put in there. Another thing that they might do is make polymer type mixtures. So I talked about polyethylene here, but they'll often make polypropylene, polyethylene copolymers. So they're inherently already self-contaminated, and there's no way of separating those. So the things that should be done from a polymer synthesis side, where possible, is stick to a single polymer type for the first part, and then have some kind of product passport that contains composition and origin of all the materials that you put in there. So even a small contaminant can have a really big effect on recycling. So I think clarity around that is really important. And then moving on to polymer processors, are the ones that take the pellets, buy them in. They can put in some additives to make these different form factors. Again, they'll be putting in additives or colorants and asking to make a blue bottle for some reason. That's, of course, contaminating the waste stream. They'll also be often using multi-material products. So they'll take different plastic types that have the feel that they wanted. Not always necessary to do, and they've definitely not thought about the recycling consequences of that. So what they need to do is where possible, stick to a single resin type. And then think about recyclability by design. So if you're using multiple resin types in different materials and you're putting them together, think about, can they be separated? What will happen to them in a sorting process? So will the lid of this PE bottle, will that come off in the recycling process? Will they be separable, or will they go together and actually reduce the quality of the final recycled product? So making sure that the products you make actually are sortable and processable in the systems that are available. So for the brand owners, they're the ones that buy these separate bottles and caps and then take these stickers and use some adhesive to stick it on there. They could be exacerbating this problem of problematic fixtures. So is this lid detachable, and what will happen to it in the recycling process? So they also need to think about this recyclability by design, and using compatible components, right? So the glue that they're using, does that label have to be recycled with the bottle, or does that glue have to be loose enough so that it'll detach for optimal recycling? And then keep that product passport up to date so that there's a full traceable backstory for that product. So we know exactly what's in there, what are the potential contaminants. If there's something wrong in the recycling, we can find out what what small additive that is that's giving that issue. And retailers actually have a really strong position here. So big brand retailers put a lot of demand on brand owners of how they want the product to look and how it will sell in the supermarkets. And they really need to avoid these bad materials with confusing labeling and not suitable for recycling. And they have the opportunity to really push for more sustainable material choices. So looking at recyclability by design and making sure that they know the composition of those products that they're hosting in their stores, and that they have a clear end of life aim for all these plastic products that are being sold. And then finally, consumers, as you've heard from Torik, there's so much confusion. There's a bombardment of messaging that's mostly inconsistent and isn't really tailored to their local areas, where there's all this inconsistency. So consumers just need reliable information so they can make the good choices, because they are willing, they just don't have the capacity to do it with this plethora of confusion. So if we're then thinking about how to enable all of this, because it's great to tell the supply chain they need to do this, but how do we actually make them do it? We need a consistent path in legislation and some oversight that really focuses on the entire supply chain. Expressly left out consumers here because they're a bit of the dupe in this situation. They're being blamed for a lot of stuff that's a bit out of their control. And what we're looking for in this legislation is plastics designed for recycling, as I spoke about. We're looking for a traceable supply chain, so we know what the materials are and what the additives are, and need proper detail, actual chemical detail of what's in there, not just a headliner of this is PET. And then also some accountability for non-compliance. If you're heavily contaminating the recycling stream, you're doing a lot of damage beyond your own product, and there needs to be accountability there, right? But to make the supply chain actually work along into this, you need to assure them that there's going to be a consistent waste collection. So if they're making their products more recyclable, they need to know that it's actually going to be collected, and that there's going to be the sorting systems that they're aspiring to use, and that the processing infrastructure is adaptable to the products that they're making. So I think those were all the kind of lessons that we got out of the hierarchy. And then we sat down in our interdisciplinary group and tried to make a bit of a policy report out of that. And I'll hand back to Torik just for the last few slides.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so based on what I was discussing before in terms of what we learned from the households and also feeding from that, so working out from the bins, really taking the bins and the waste that was collected in them as an empirical starting point, and then all of the different packaging and those as entries into and ways of thinking about this whole landscape, I suppose, of interests and values and challenges of different stakeholders, which Chris has discussed. There, we were really aware that we had a huge amount of information, and we wanted to distill that in a way that we hope would have impact with a wider audience, and specifically a policy sort of audience and policy makers. So what we did is as Chris said, we sat down and we thought, okay, so what would be the best practice, the three sort of best practice outcomes of our research? What do we want people to get, policymakers to get from what we've done? I think the first thing we sort of said immediately is we need to have there needs to be a better appreciation and understanding of consumer practice to shape recycling infrastructure and policy. So if we start with what households do and we understand the challenges that are faced and why they face those challenges, and we don't just point the finger of blame and think it's down to a poor amount of knowledge or a lack of interest and ambivalence to sustainability challenges, what do we get from that? And actually what we learn is that we really do need to start tidying up the materials and the packaging that we've got in circulation. We need to start thinking about design for recyclability as a holistic thing and a holistic challenge. Based on that, and what that bridges into is this issue of standardization and consistency across the supply chain. So I think that map that Chris presents there is thinking about the connections between, say, chemical firms, retailers, households, MRFs where stuff's assorted, and then actually the companies that actually do the recycling, so turn the packaging into pellets? What are the connections between those? And if at one end there's colorants and additives that are being used that completely jeopardize what can happen at the other end, that's not good. And we need to start thinking about what legislation there would be to avoid that. And building on that, we start thinking about those relationships. We also need a tool, in a sense, that stakeholders, policymakers could go and look at and engage with, that is intelligible, that is easy to follow, and basically lays out in a very pragmatic sense what are the current best options from a sustainability perspective for the packaging that's out there. So in some instances that might be mechanical recycling, in some instances that might be chemical recycling, and there might be still some items that inevitably it's best to go for in incineration. There isn't really a one solution to the problem that's faced. The problem's a bit is more complex than that, but we can only start thinking of those best pathways if we map out and start with the materials that are there and think about what they demand. So we've distilled that in this report, and we can circulate, if there are people who are interested, we can circulate a copy of the report after among yourselves as well. The good news is, so we published the policy report in March. Based on that, we've done a lot of sort of media and press engagement and outreach as well. So I think a good sign actually is there is interest in the research that we've conducted, and I think it is actually having an impact. And I think the importance of this research comes as well because the politics of sorting this out is a consistent battle. Last week I was listening to the radio in the morning, and I heard the Prime Minister talking about the rollout of either we're scrapping consistent collections for the time being or parking that because the sentiment was that it was ridiculous that we were going to have 7 different bins. And he quoted the Environment Act from 2021 based on that. And that's not in the Environment Act. There's a discussion there of recyclable waste streams, but nothing to do with bins. And there's a provision in there that waste collection authorities can, if it's not economically justified or sustainably, environmentally justified, they can collect multiple recyclables in the same bin. The point being here is there's a lot of incoherence, not just in terms of all the materials and all the messaging that's out there, but in terms of the political debate that's going on. And I think the research is our attempt to really intervene, I suppose, add some coherence to that, and also think differently about how we can handle waste in a way that is more sustainable. And that, I suppose, is about challenging some of the rubbish that's out there, both material and sort of discursively as well. So yeah, we've written a piece for The Conversation. If anyone's interested in having a look at that, we wrote a piece for MRW as well. We did a segment with BBC One for one of the breakfast shows, and then also some other outlets as well have picked up. So it is resonating and continue to. And if anyone's interested in learning more about that, then just drop one of us an email. And I would encourage people to go and look at the hierarchy that Chris has been able to design and have a look at the policy report as well. Yeah, so that's pretty much it, unless Chris wants to add anything as we finish up. But I think the thing I would say to finish is none of this would be possible without a lot of the support of our sponsors. We've got a lot of industry partners and sponsors. It definitely wouldn't have been possible without colleagues at the SMI hub within the Royce Institute of Manchester. We had about 12 or 15 of us going and sorting through waste over 2 weekends, and without the support of those, we wouldn't have been able to produce and work with the data that we've got. So thanks to those, and I'll leave it there, I think, Steve.
Thanks, Torik and Chris. Really interesting presentation and fascinating project, and one that I think I can safely say is very timely and important, not least because of the Prime Minister's comments recently. And I think it really shows the complexity of the system. Since sometimes people think that either all plastic can just be recycled, or all plastic is evil and has no purpose. So I think this project really helps to highlight these this complexity. So we've got some questions. Helena asks, which says, I didn't realize there was so much contamination within packaging, like the Head and Shoulders bottle. What would happen with a bottle like this in Manchester at the moment?
Ooh. Well, Manchester, well, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, except for Wigan. So there's 10 local authorities that make up GMCA. Wigan do their own thing. There's a history to that. I think it's since 2008, but the other 9 would ask for plastic bottles lids removed. So it would, I think they would want it in the general way, unless you can get the lid off it. That would be what I think would be. And if it did end up in the recycling and went through, I don't think it would get rejected. I don't think it would necessarily mean the load was rejected. And I don't necessarily know if it would be hand picked out as part of the hand sort they would do and pulled out, but it would probably end up in a pile of what's called jazzy waste, typically referred to as jazzy sort of bales, which is coloured, a bale of, say, coloured plastic bottles, and they carry a different they carry a lesser value than the clear plastic bottles, and then they would be shipped somewhere to be processed, hopefully. But where exactly is it, you know, it won't be the same from day to day, I don't think.
Thank you for that. Is there, I was wondering if there was a similar system like this in operation anywhere else in the world? Is anyone else doing this kind of thing, or is it something our focus is obviously the UK, but presumably it's a similar problem around the world?
Well, yeah, I'll take that one. So I've been expanding this. We started a bit local Manchester, and I've now moved on to the United Nations, where we're working on a plastics treaty. There's things that are locally relevant. So depending on where you are, the different color sortings, for example, that will have value are different. But a lot of the baseline best practices are universal. So no matter where you are in the world, a PET bottle and a PET hot tub and tray cannot be recycled together. The material, the plastic in itself in a chemical level is too different. So they won't form a proper product if you try to mechanically recycle them. That doesn't matter where you are. So a lot of these kind of basic rules are universally applicable, right? So that's why Sprite, for example, changed their bottle from green to clear, because no matter where you are in the world, that's a small amount of progress. So there are a lot of universal rules that can be applied everywhere. But then there's also the question of technological readiness, right? So we're in a privileged position in the UK that we can talk about having these more advanced sorting and recycling systems, which you won't be able to everywhere in the world. But we should really be setting an example and doing that to a higher level than we are now.
It's really interesting and preempts one of the other questions about how we come to a standard practice. So yeah, it is good that there are some fundamental kind of rules. Emily asks, how easy would it be to create and enforce legislation on making the producer responsible for the full life cycle of plastic products? And is there any interest in this within industries or politics?
How easy would it be? The answer is probably proving to be very hard. I think that in general, when I've talked to industry or legislators or partners around the world, there is a willingness to do it. There's a tendency to get bogged down in detail, and these frustrating delays that come for consistent collection and so on. I'll just stop sharing for a sec. So some of these delays that we see with consistent collection and so on, they're born out of focus on detail and thinking about wanting to get it right, but then the delay is also then causing industry to wait, and then everyone's waiting on each other, and you kind of get this delay. I don't think it's necessarily a lack of willingness or bad actors trying to stop it. It is really complex, You have this historically disjointed supply chain where someone who makes polymer pellets has never thought about what product it's being formed into or what happens to it at end of life, and they're trying to bridge that gap takes time because there's so much lack of knowledge. And I think that's kind of the biggest barrier, which is very difficult. And that's before we start talking about the cost of building this kind of infrastructure to making this happen and who's going to pay for it.
Sort of connected to that one actually is a response from Helena. She says that she seems to remember that pre-pandemic there was going to be a national review by the government to attempt to streamline recycling schemes. And do you know what happened to this?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, so it's probably that would have been the consistent collection stuff. So we basically have sort of over the past 4 or 5 years, I think it's referred to by Recoup or RAP as a sort of policy whirlpool. So you've got a number of different policies that have been discussed: extended producer responsibility, deposit return schemes, and consistent collections. The idea with consistent collections is that you just have a standardized set of materials that would be consistently collected regardless of the area, across England and Wales. But I think more broadly we're thinking about it with the UK, and it's basically just been kicked into the long grass, so to speak. And that was what I was referring to there in terms of the 7 bin discussion of 7 bins. That comes from the idea of having consistent collections. And the number 7 came from the 7 different recyclable waste streams: metal, paper, plastic, food. I can't remember. And then you'd have the remaining bin would be your general waste bin. But there was never the actuality of actually having them in just 7 bin. The 7 rollout of 7 bins was never really going to come about. So yeah, it's just really been kicked into the long grass, and it's a real shame actually, because it just means that we're sort of arguably stuck in this sort of position of limbo where a lot of companies that you will speak to and a lot of local authorities, for example, they don't know what the state of play and what they're going to be expected to do a year or 2 or 3 years down the line, and that means that they're not confident with making decisions or investments. So if you say a local authority where they don't collect, for example, pots, tubs, or trays, or they don't collect flexibles, well, if they don't know if they're going to get ring fence funding for that, they don't know if they're going to be mandated to do that, and they don't know if. So why would they be the first actor? Why would they move on that? So you have a lot of inertia, basically, little change, and things sort of stay the same. So yeah, kicked into the long grass.
Thanks for that. What do we do about or with compostables in this?
Chris, I can see your face straight away. You love compostables.
I mean, they're an example of things that work great in the lab, but then real world hits you like a ton of bricks. There's a whole section about biodegradable plastics in the hierarchy, and basically the term biodegradable is already a bit of an issue. When is it compostable? Is it home compostable? Is it industrially compostable? What does industrially compostable mean? That's a different definition from, well, country to country at least. So it kind of depends. In an ideal world where you had a home compostable material and everyone had a compost heap, that would be great. I live in an apartment building. I don't know where I'd put my compost heap. So that's not really helpful. So I'd then put it into the bin. And if I'm really wish cycling here, I'd put it into the plastics bin if we had a compostable plastic. That would then go to a sorting center, and the sorting center would not be geared towards this new plastic material. So it would very highly likely be contaminating one of the other plastic streams, often into PET, for example. So if we think of PLA straws, which were popular for a while, they would be going through a sorting system and end up with PET, where they'd then be extruded out together. And because it's a biodegradable material, when the new product is being formed, it's slightly degrading, and then you get your new material and it kind of falls apart. So it's actually doing a lot of harm instead of the good that was intended. So that's where the reality and the idea of the good that it would do don't really match up. So it's a really huge problem of finding areas where those materials would be useful. So a biodegradable coffee cup is useful if it's going into a biodegradable composting stream, but that's mostly not the case. That doesn't mean that they're all terrible and useless. There's an interesting report in the hierarchy you can find about 150 applications for these compostable plastics. So if you think of agriculture, for example, they'll often put these black plastic sheets down early in the season to cover the mounds for potatoes or strawberries and things like that. That plastic is usually just left there when the roots then grow through, and at the end of the season, that plastic is usually just ground down and mulched when they clear the field. So that's obviously causing a lot of plastic pollution on the farm. If that was biodegradable, that's great. That'll be fertilizing your farm. It's definitely not leaving the farm. So you know exactly where it is and what it's doing and why it would be there. So there are areas where it's good, but it's not just replace all the plastics we have now. It's just not realistic. So it's really important to make smart, informed decisions on where you change those kind of materials.
Okay, thanks for that. I think we're drawing to a close, but there is one last question that's just come in from Amal. It's why don't we learn from more successful, efficient recycling systems in the world, like Germany and Austria?
Well, so for a lot of the information in the hierarchy is based on best practice, which other countries might be further along towards that. So I have based myself on sometimes on European reports and European best practice structures. Germany is world leader with a headline rate of around in the low 60%. That's not great. That's also not the final actual value that comes out. So even the successful systems aren't as great as we think they are. And we all need to be doing way better than the world leaders now. So if we all aspire to that, we're kind of a bit of a low ambition target to have. So we need to be doing even better than that. And they are an example, but there's then also local issues that'll change what you can and can't do. So I grew up in Belgium, where I think we have 8 bins at the moment at home. I've grown up with minimum of 5, so when number 6 comes in, that's fine. But if you do that in this apartment building, I don't have the space for that. There's 1 bin. We can maybe squeeze in 2, but other than that, so there's infrastructure and there's the background of what the populace is used to and things like that. So there's definitely other things to consider. But yeah, we do look at other countries and what can be done better, but no one's perfect for sure.
Can I just add quickly to that? I think it's really there can be something gleaned from looking at what other countries do, but I think what you were saying there, Chris, about even the best countries, when you're talking about being in the 60% and stuff, it's just like we need to see and think about this in a global framing, I think, and I think that's why the work that's going on with the UN is really important, because it's a global treaty. It won't work if we just keep thinking about plastics recycling in different smaller spatial registers, the local, the city, because that's not the way that we produce and consume and dispose of goods.
Thank you. I think we've reached the end now. So thank you for all those fantastic answers to the questions. I'm sure you wouldn't mind if people dropped you an email or two if you had more questions. But
please do.
Yeah, and obviously we've got the hierarchy and the report to read as well. So yeah, thanks to both of you. Really interesting, as I said, and keep an eye on the Eventbrite and newsletters for the next events in the series, which should be next month, I would have thought. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Steve.
Cheers, mate.